It's a beautiful muscle, and I bet you don't even know what I'm talking about. That would be, I'm actually talking about the Sartorius. If you do not know what the Sartorius is and you want to know how it is sort of affecting your running and how it works in your running, but more importantly, how to strengthen it, how to stretch it, and why it's so important, the yoga poses you can do, all that good stuff. We are going to deep dive into that today. I'm Morgan, I'm a registered dietitian and a yoga teacher who focuses primarily on helping runners feel their best and fuel their best. So, first things first, Sartorius is probably my favorite muscle to talk about, and that's because in anatomy class, we had like those, we had a coloring book where you would like color in all the color pencils different muscles, and the Sartorius is this beautiful muscle that overlays your quads. It's a hip flexor. And it's actually an abductor as well, so it moves as part of the moving your leg away from the center line of the body. And so the Sartorius comes from the outer hip line, and then it's going to cross the midline, cross over those quad muscles, and then it comes all the way down and attaches into the tibia, which is the bigger muscle in the lower part of your leg. So it's this really like eloquent S-shaped muscle that's actually the longest muscle in the body. And its role is, again, hip flexion. So think about running. Hip flexion is bringing your knee up towards you. And so obviously you don't do it quite this much when you're running, but there is definitely that action of bringing your knee up. So it does get activated quite a bit through that. And then it's also going to be an abduction. So anything where you bring your knee away from you can strengthen it or stretch it depending on sort of what the action is doing. So that's sort of its main role in the body as it pertains to running. Now obviously we're not really doing this in running, but that's part of the reason I find that it can get so tight for runners, is because with running we're always in a very forward plane, so we're not doing anything that is abduction, and we're not really doing any sort of twisting or the arching of the spine. It's a lot of compression and it's a lot of forward action. So that's why yoga is so great for running, is that you're moving the spine in all those directions to get that full, well-rounded effect and really balance out your training schedule. So the three yoga poses that I really recommend to my students to both stretch and strengthen the Sartorius, especially if you are having any kind of hip imbalance issues, sometimes it can be helpful to dive into this muscle specifically. So the first and probably the key yoga pose is going to be tree pose, or what we call vrikshasana. Now to do tree pose, make sure that your toes point straight down. None of this like business where your toes are pointing in any funky direction. Point your toes straight down, and you want to flex your foot. Push your foot into your thigh and your thigh into your foot, so it's really nailed down there. And then think about this inner leg line. Work your inner leg line away from you, but as you do that, hug your glutes underneath of you. Lift your chest, stretch your spine, be sure your abdomen's nice and toned. For more balance, support, and strength, keep your hands at heart center. Otherwise, extend overhead. So, tree pose, you can do that kind of after a run or in part of your home regimen, definitely in any of the yoga practices that I teach. Tree tends to come up a lot. People tend to really like it. So if you did do it on one side, just do it on the other side to get that balance. So you're, again, strengthening, right? So because I can't even talk sometimes in balance, but because that Sartorius is helping to move your leg away from the body, it's that rotation, it's going to need to be activated, but it's also being stretched here because it does cross in both. It's part of the knee joint, and then it's also kind of part of that hip joint. So because it's kind of this unique muscle, I find you can stretch and strengthen it in multiple different ways. So first pose is that tree pose. The second pose that's going to help strengthen it is what I like to call, it's goddess or horse. It has a few different names. Turn your toes out slightly and then sit low into your hips. Be sure your knees are in line with your ankles, and then activate your glutes. So if your inner thigh is not as strong as your outer thigh and glutes, which is a common imbalance, what we would see is our knees coming in, which is what we do not want. So as you sit down, work your knees outside. So again, they do stack on top of your ankles. This is going to require a lot more strength from those inner thighs, those adductor muscles, including the sartorius. So you can hold that a few breaths, and then let it go. And since we just activated it, now we're going to stretch it out a bit. So tree pose, goddess pose, the third yoga pose that you can do for the sartorius is going to be a straight up butterfly. This is another one. External rotation, this action is really difficult for runners. And in fact, when I first came to my yoga practice from a running background, literally I was like really rounded and could barely come forward. So if that is you, no fear, but I want you to sit yourself up on a foam roller that you may have close by. Maybe sit yourself up on some books, some blankets, and that way, when you hinge forward at your hips, you have a little bit more freedom, because generally then these hips are pretty tight. So press your feet together, keep them nice and activated, and then it's taught multiple ways. The goal really is dependent on what's going on in the overall class, whether you're rounding the spine or keeping the spine straight. Because we're focused on just kind of stretching out the inner thighs, and we have not really warmed up or done anything with our spine, you can just sit up nice and tall, but feeling and noticing that action and sensation. Again, flexing your feet, flaring your toes to protect this knee joint is key here as well. Anytime the knee is bent, flex your foot, flare your toes. Okay. So third pose was butterfly, and the fourth pose is also going to get into the outer hip line. And we just are losing the mic. Losing it. It's kind of, there we go. Usually I have it on the side, but today I decided to put it on the back, and that is what happened. So, pigeon pose could also work into fire logs. It's going to be that same sort of action of strengthening. So you're going to flex your left foot, flare your toes, cross your left ankle over your right thigh. More doable, walk your foot further away from you. More difficult, your foot comes in towards the glutes. And now instead of kind of hugging everything in, roll your shoulders back, work your front knee towards the front edge of your mat or away from you. And then look down at your hips. Are they imbalanced? Can you work your left hip forward? That's that same action. Big breath in, big breath out. Switch sides. Flex your right foot, flare your toes. So this could work into a deeper hip stretch. We're gonna just hang out here because again, we're not really targeting that outer hip so much, and for many of us it's pretty intense. So we're gonna work into those things slowly. Okay, so the 4 yoga poses again, just to sort of revisit. Tree pose, number 1. Goddess, butterfly, and then pigeon will all help you to work into that sartorius. Working into foam rolling, which is the second part of it. The first way that you can foam roll into your sartorius is going to be right at that hip crease. So literally place the foam roller right at your hip crease. And you may not feel anything, but foam rolling is still going to work into increasing blood flow, increasing range of motion, and just decreasing sort of that overall stiffness. So you can kind of roll side to side, working into that joint. And then because it's that muscle that goes on the exterior and crosses the midline, you can roll the outer line of the top hip to start to get into the origin and the insertion, or not the insertion, just the origin. Insertion would be down there. Good. And then, so I'm going to face this way. Moving all around today, Anya. So to get into your sartorius, put the foam roller underneath your inner thigh. Your toes are turned away from the body. Gotta love those garbage trucks. But someone's gotta do it, right? And then there's always life, which always distracts you, especially when you're foam rolling and you kind of want to run away from intense sensation, or at least that's my pattern. So, oh my gosh, a lot of times for me this is a crazy, crazy intense one. So I just kind of hang out here for a while. Ideally, you roll back and forth. But I just like to kind of simmer in that sticky spot and breathe. I always like to ask people if they're ask my students if they're getting warm. And then the overall general consensus is a heck yes, because you're increasing that blood flow. And when you're increasing the blood flow and removing all of that lactic acid, it's intense work on the body. So getting hot is part of that process. So there you have it, and obviously do the other side, but again your Sartorius is going to cross in that midline, and those are my two favorite foam rolling techniques that you can use to get into the Sartorius. So 4 yoga poses, 2 rolling techniques, get into that inner thigh, and get into some of that good stuff that's going to help you feel better in your running. Comment below, what was your favorite part, or what is something you plan on incorporating into your own yoga practice? I would love to hear from you, and give it a like so I know that this is the kind of content you guys are loving, and subscribe for a new video every week. I will see you soon. Until next time, keep it kind.